She was 19, and she had nothing but a borrowed apron, a bone-handled knife wrapped in oiled cloth, and a name that carried no weight in the county. Her name was Lucy Walker, and on a gray morning in the last week of October, she stood in the far yard of Barley End, an estate of some 600 acres, in the low green country, under a slate-colored sky, and watched a duke's steward push open the gate of a mean little sty and wave a gloved hand at the animals inside, as though he were dismissing a bad debt. There were 11 of them, thin-flanked and long-snouted, marked with rusty patches along their spines and ears that hung too low for the fashionable pigs kept up at the home farm. They were the pigs the estate was ashamed of, the pigs the Duke wanted quietly gone, and the Duke had decided in the manner of men who own too much to be exact, about anything, that the girl who kept the scullery kitchen might take them if she liked, and if she did not like it, she might leave them to the knacker. Lucy took them. She took them because she had been taught by a woman, now 3 years in the churchyard, that no living thing is beneath care, and because she could already see, in the shape of their jaws and the set of their small dark eyes, something the fine gentleman at the sale ring had not troubled to notice. She could not yet know that within a 12-month her hams would travel by cart and by rail, and by the polished hand of a county steward, to a table in London, where the king himself would eat them, and ask, with mild surprise, where such meat had been raised. That is the story you are about to hear, and it is a true one, in the way stories from country places are true, stitched together from parish talk and ledger entries, and the memory of an old cook who wept when she told it. Before we go on, settle in wherever you are, put the kettle on if you have one, and if you would like more stories of quiet women who made something out of nothing, do subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, for we like to know who is with us by the fire. Now to Barley End, and to Lucy Walker, and to 11 pigs that no one wanted. The morning she took them into her keeping, the frost had not lifted from the low pasture beyond the sty, and the air smelled of coal smoke from the great chimneys of the house, and of the sourness that comes off any pen, too long neglected, and Lucy stood a while after the steward had gone, and looked at each animal in turn, and she counted them again, and she named none of them, for she had learnt from her grandmother that beasts kept for the salt did not want names, and she folded her hands under her apron, and set about calculating, in the careful way of people who have never had money, what she would need in the way of barley meal, and skimmed whey, and windfall apples, and the good clean straw that the head groom sometimes let go for a penny a truss when he was in a generous humor. She did not smile. She did not, in the way of girls in cheap novels, lift her chin against the wind and swear a private oath. She simply began, and that beginning, small and unwitnessed, and full of the ordinary arithmetic of survival, is where the whole of what follows must be understood to have started, in a muddy yard at Barley End under a gray October sky. To know why a girl of 19 was standing in that yard alone, and why she had been given the worst of the pigs rather than a place at the long scrubbed table in the servants' hall, one must go back a little way into her life, though not so far as some tellers would go, for Lucy's history was not long and not complicated, and it explained her in only a handful of facts. She had been born in a 2-room cottage on the western edge of the parish, to a woman named Anne Walker, a lace mender, and to a father whose name did not appear on the parish register, and whose face Lucy never learnt. Her mother had died of the winter fever when Lucy was 4, and Lucy had been taken in by her mother's mother, a widow of 60 called Martha Bligh, who kept 3 pigs of her own and a smokehouse made of tarred boards behind her cottage, and who cured meat for half the laboring families in the district, for a shilling and a share of the flitch. Martha Bligh had been Lucy's whole education. She had taught the child to read from a chapbook of hymns, and to write her name on the slate that hung by the fire, and she had taught her, more importantly, and more slowly, everything she herself knew of pigs. She had taught her how to judge a piglet by the width of the shoulder and the length of the back, how to mix a mash of barley meal and boiled nettles and whey that would put good firm flesh on a lean frame, how to keep a sty sweet with fresh straw and lime, how to bleed a beast quickly and cleanly, so the meat took the salt without souring, how to rub the hams with the coarse grey salt from Droitwich, and the sugar from the grocer's brown paper, and a scraping of saltpetre no larger than a shilling, and how to hang them in the damp, cool dark of a smokehouse, where the fire of oak chips and apple wood must be neither too hot, nor too cold, nor ever, in any circumstance, allowed to flame. Martha had said little while she taught, being a woman who kept her words for prayers, but she had watched the girl's hands with a patience that Lucy remembered afterwards as the truest kind of love she had ever known. Martha Bligh had died in the spring of Lucy's 16th year, sitting up in her chair by the fire, with her knitting in her lap, and Lucy had washed her, and laid her out, and buried her in the churchyard, on a mild April morning, and she had come away from the grave with 3 things: a debt of £4.11 owed to the grocer, a smokehouse that the landlord took back within the fortnight, and the bone-handled boning knife her grandmother had used for 40 years, wrapped in the oiled cloth in which it had always been kept. That knife she carried in the deep pocket of her apron every day thereafter, and she carried it still, on the October morning, at Barley End, and she would carry it, though she did not yet know this, into rooms she could not at 19 have imagined entering. The manner of Lucy's coming to Barley End had itself been a small, quiet ejection, though of a kind that left no bruise, and no accusation, and no name, to lay at any door. In the summer after her grandmother's burial, she had walked the 6 miles from the parish to the estate, with a bundle in a square of linen, and a letter from the vicar's wife, written in a hand so careful it looked engraved, and the housekeeper at Barley End, a woman named Mrs. Peake, who was 52, and had served in the house since she was 14, had read the letter twice, and set Lucy in the scullery for 6 shillings a month, and her board. There Lucy had scoured coppers and scalded milk pans, and plucked pheasants and gutted hares, for 2 years and 4 months, and in all that time she had spoken to the Duke exactly once, when he had passed through the back passage on a wet afternoon, and asked, without looking at her, whose girl she was. She had answered Martha Bligh's, and he had grunted and gone on. He had not, she was certain, remembered the answer past the next doorway. And so, when on the 3rd Monday of that October, the under-butler came down to the scullery and told her that his Grace wished to see her by the far yard at 10 o'clock. She had dried her hands on her apron and taken off the heavy sacking one she wore for the coppers and put on the clean one beneath, and she had gone up through the kitchen garden and along the beach walk without asking anyone what the matter was, because asking, in Mrs. Peake's household, was not the way a scullery girl kept her place. The Duke was a large man in a green coat and mud on his boots, and he had with him his steward, Mr. Ridley, a thin man of about 40, with a leather book under his arm, and he had spoken to Lucy across the sty-rail in the tone of a man giving away a broken chair. He had said the pigs were of no account, and that he would not have them among the Berkshires he was breeding up for the show at Leicester, and that the knacker would give him 9 shillings for the lot, and Mr. Ridley thought that a shame, and that if she, being Martha Bligh's granddaughter, and understood by Mrs. Peake to know pigs, cared to have them for nothing, and to keep them out of his sight in the far yard, he would count it done with. He had not asked whether she wished it. He had turned before her answer, and walked back up the beach walk, with Mr. Ridley writing in the leather book behind him, and by the time she said, quietly, "Yes, Your Grace, thank you," there had been no one there to hear her but the pigs. She had understood, standing in the frost of the far yard, with her hands folded under her apron, that she had been moved, not sent away, for she still had her cot in the attic over the scullery, and her 6 shillings a month, but moved sideways and downward, in the small ranked country of the house, out of the kitchens, where a girl might rise to undercook or still-room maid, and into the yards, where a girl was a yard girl, and stayed one. Mrs. Peake, when Lucy returned to fetch her clogs and her second apron, had looked at her once over the rim of her spectacles, and said only, "Well then," and had given her a bundle of clean sacking and a tin cup, and told her that her dinner would be sent down to the yard from the servants' hall, and that she was not to come tramping muck through the scullery door. Lucy had said yes, Mrs. Peake, and had gone out into the yard again, with the sacking under her arm, and she had not, in any of it, argued or wept or asked for a reason, because Martha Bly had taught her that reasons given to a girl in her position were seldom worth the breath they cost, and that work was the only answer that anyone in the end could not take back. The walk from the scullery door to the far yard was 3/4 of a mile by the beach walk, and 1/2 a mile again by the cart track that skirted the paddock, and Lucy made it 4 times that first afternoon, carrying down what she thought she would need. She carried first her own small trunk, which was a deal box 1.5 feet long, with iron corners, and had been her mother's, and inside it a change of linen and 2 clean aprons, and a woolen shawl, and the chapbook of hymns from which Martha Bly had taught her to read, and a stub of pencil, and a folded piece of paper on which she had written, in the round, careful hand Martha had made her practice, the receipts for the mash and the cure. She carried next a bucket and a scrubbing brush, and a jar of quicklime from the yard boy for 2pence, and after that a truss of clean wheat straw from the head groom, a man named Whittle, who was 61, and had known Martha Bly in his youth, and let Lucy have the truss for a penny, instead of the 2pence he charged the estate. The cart track was rutted and greasy, with the night's frost melting under a low white sun, and the hedgerows on either side of it were bright with haws and the last hips, and rooks were down in the stubble of the harvested barley field, and Lucy noticed each of these things as she walked, not as beauty, but as the furniture of the place she now lived in, because she had learned long ago that a person put down in a new country did well to look about her. She passed the dairy and the ice house, and the row of estate cottages, where the woodman's wife was pegging out a line of grey shirts, and the woodman's wife nodded to her without curiosity, and Lucy nodded back. By the 4th journey, the sun was low behind the elms, and her shoulders ached in a plain, honest way, and her boots were black to the ankle, with the mud of the cart track, and she stood in the far yard in the blue dusk, with her breath making clouds, and she looked at the 11 pigs in the sty, and she felt, for the first time since Martha Bly had died 3 years earlier, that she was standing on ground of her own choosing. The far yard at Barley End lay at the northeast corner of the home farm, 3/4 of a mile from the great house by the beach walk, and it had been let go for longer than anyone in the present household could quite remember. It was a square of trodden earth, about 40 feet on a side, walled on 3 sides by old buildings of local red sandstone, laid in lime mortar, that had crumbled in places to a soft grey powder, and open on the 4th side to a paddock overgrown with dock and nettle. The sty itself stood along the north wall, 6 pens divided by oak boards worn smooth and grey, and half rotted at the base, with a stone trough running the length of it, cracked in 2 places, and mended once with iron staples that had rusted through. Beyond the pens was a small yard of broken flags, and beyond that, a low building of 2 rooms under a single roof of split slate, and it was this building that Mr. Ridley had, without ceremony, indicated to Lucy as the place she might use. The first room was a boiling house, 12 feet by 14, with a stone floor sunk 1/2 inch under a copper cauldron set in brickwork, the copper itself green with verdigris but sound, the firebox beneath it choked with the leaves of 3 autumns. There was a chimney of red brick that let daylight through at the crown, a small deep window with 4 panes of leaded glass, of which 2 were cracked, and a stout door of elm hung on hand-forged iron hinges. The walls had once been whitewashed, and now showed in patches, the pinkish stone beneath, and along the back wall stood a bench of oak, scarred with the marks of 100 knives, and darkened with the tallow of many years. The second room, entered by a low doorway from the first, was smaller, and colder, and darker, and Lucy knew it for what it was, the moment she stepped inside. It was a curing room, 8 feet by 10, with a floor of blue Leah's flags worn shallow in the center, by feet long dead, walls of the same rough stone plastered and rough cast, and above her head, a heavy oak beam, running the length of the room, with 8 iron hooks set into it, at regular intervals, each hook black with age, and the grease of hams long since eaten. There was no window, only a square vent high in the gable, closable by a wooden shutter on a leather hinge, and the air inside was cool and damp and still, and smelled faintly, under the mildew and the mouse, of old smoke and old salt. Lucy stood in the doorway of that room with her hand on the jamb for a long moment. She had walked into a smokehouse not unlike Martha Bligh's, but larger and older and better built, and she saw in a single sweep of her eye what the estate had forgotten it possessed. The beam was sound. The hooks were sound. The vent was sound. The chimney of the boiling house next door could be swept and rebedded in an afternoon. The copper wanted only scouring with sand and vinegar. The trough could be patched with lead. The rotten oak of the penboards could be replaced from the estate sawpit for the asking. She counted her wants in her head, as she had counted the pigs, and she saw that the far yard, which the Duke had given her, because he had no further use for it, was in fact a small and perfect thing that had only been waiting to be seen. She swept the boiling house that evening by the light of a tallow dip, and slept on clean straw in the corner of it, with her shawl over her, and Martha Bligh's boning knife under her hand, and she did not dream. In the morning she began on the curing room, because it was the room in which the whole enterprise would live or die. She carried out 3 barrows of leaf litter and mouse nests, and the papery husks of long-dead wasp hives, and she scrubbed the flags with quicklime and water, and a stiff brush, working from the far corner, toward the door on her hands and knees, and it was in the far corner, where the flags met the wall beneath the oldest of the iron hooks, that she found the flag that rocked. It was a slab of blue lisias, about 18 inches square, bedded on nothing but earth and its own weight, and when Lucy pressed the edge of it with her palm, the opposite edge lifted a finger's breadth. She fetched the boning knife from her apron pocket, slid its blade around the joint to break the crust of old lime, took the poker from the boiling house grate, and lifted the flag by leverage and set it aside against the wall. Beneath was a shallow hollow lined with brick, about a foot deep and the width of the flag, and in the hollow lay a small tin box, the size of a family Bible, brown with rust along the seams but sound, and beside the box a folded square of oiled cloth, and beneath the cloth a stone jar stoppered with wax. Lucy knelt in the damp of the flags and lifted the box out with both hands and set it on the bench in the boiling house next door, where the light through the leaded pane fell on it. Inside the tin, wrapped in a piece of blue sugar paper, was a small canvas purse, and inside the purse were 42 gold sovereigns and a half-sovereign, bright as though newly minted, and a folded paper written in a small, careful sloping hand in ink, faded to the color of tea. Under the purse was a woman's silver thimble, worn thin along one edge, and a lock of pale brown hair tied with a scrap of red thread. Lucy laid the money aside without counting it a second time, and unfolded the paper and read it slowly, following the lines with her finger, as Martha Bligh had taught her. To whoever finds this, and I hope it is a person in want of it, and not in easy circumstances. My name is Hannah Southey, and I was cook and pig woman at Barley End for 31 years, from the year 1809 to the year 1840, in the time of the old Duke and his father before him. I cured the hams in this room, and I kept my savings under this stone, because I had no family to leave them to, my daughter Ellen having died at the age of 4 in the winter of 1819, and her hair is in this box with my thimble, that was my mother's. I am 71 this Michaelmas, and my hands are no longer steady, and I am going to my sister at Ludlow, and shall not come back. The 42 sovereigns and the half are honest money, saved from the sale of hams in the market at Ashby, over many years, a penny and a shilling at a time. Whoever you are, use it well, and be kind to the pigs, for they are better creatures than most who keep them. I hope you find this room as I leave it, sound and sweet, and I hope you have better luck in it than I had, though I have had, on the whole, a life I do not complain of. Hannah Southey, this 4th day of October, 1840. Lucy read the letter through twice and then a third time, and then she laid it flat on the bench beside the sovereigns and the thimble, and the lock of pale brown hair, and she took Martha Bligh's boning knife from her apron pocket, and unwrapped it from its oiled cloth, and laid it beside the thimble, and she sat down on the bench in the cold boiling house of the far yard at Barley End, and she put her face in her hands, not weeping, but breathing very slowly, as one breathes who has come at last within sight of a shore. She sat so for the better part of an hour, with the light from the leaded window moving slowly across the bench, and then she folded Hannah Southey's letter along its old creases and returned it to the tin box with the thimble and the lock of pale brown hair. And she counted out 5 sovereigns from the canvas purse, and put them into the deep pocket of her apron, and closed the box, and set it back in the brick-lined hollow, and lowered the flag over it, and packed the joint with fresh lime, because Martha Bligh had taught her that money kept in plain sight was money already spent. Then she took up her bucket and her scrubbing brush, and went out to begin the work she had come for. She scoured the copper cauldron over 3 long mornings with river sand, and white vinegar, and a rag wound on a stick, and the green went out of the metal in curling flakes, and a warm red rose up under her hand. She swept the boiling house chimney with a bundle of holly, tied to a length of ash pole, and she rebedded the loose bricks at the crown with lime mortar mixed in a broken pan. She sent the yard boy, whose name was Tom Blay, aged 13, to the estate sawpit, with a note in her round, careful hand, asking for 6 lengths of oak board, of a given size for the pens, and she paid the sawpit foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Reuben Hart, aged 44, 4 shillings and 6pence, and he cut the boards himself, and had them carted to the far yard by dinner. She patched the stone trough with lead poured from a ladle over a small charcoal fire, and Whittle came down the beach walk in his shirt-sleeves to hold the mold for her, saying only that he had seen Martha Bligh do the same in 1798, and she thanked him and gave him a mug of small beer from the boiling house. She bought barley meal at 3pence a stone from the estate granary through Mrs. Peake, who wrote the order in her book without a word, and looked at Lucy a long moment over her spectacles, and then wrote also a line for a half-pound of coarse grey Droitwich salt against Lucy's account. She had the dairyman, John Wisby, aged 36, keep back the skimmed whey from the morning milking in a wooden pail set behind the dairy door, for which she paid him a penny a week and a promise of a hawk at Christmas. She gathered windfall apples in the orchard, at first light, with her shawl tied round her waist as a bag. She limed the pens and laid the fresh oak boards and forked in clean wheat straw from Whittle's trusses, and she fed the 11 pigs a warm mash of barley meal, boiled nettles, whey, and mashed windfalls, twice a day, at 8 and at 4, and she stood in the sty morning and evening, running her hand along their backs and along their jaws, feeling for the width of shoulder Martha Bligh had taught her to feel for, and she saw within 3 weeks that the rusty patches were fading, and the ribs were softening under her hand. The under-butler came down once, to bring a message that his grace did not wish to be told of pigs, and Lucy said, "No, thank you," and the under-butler, whose name was Mr. Downs, looked round the swept yard and the reddened copper, and said nothing more, and walked back up the beach walk in the November drizzle, with his hands behind his back. By the 2nd week of December, the first 2 pigs were ready, and Lucy killed them cleanly at daybreak, with Martha Bligh's boning knife, and Whittle held the legs, and Tom Blay carried the pails, and she bled them into a stone jar for the black puddings Mrs. Peake had asked for at 3pence the yard. She scalded and scraped them in the copper, and hung them overnight in the cold boiling house, and the next morning she cut them down and rubbed the hams with coarse grey salt from Droitwich, and brown sugar from the grocer at the village of Neen, and saltpetre, in a quantity no larger than a shilling, and she laid them in a shallow oak trough for 3 weeks, turning them every 3rd day, and then she hung them on Hannah Southey's black iron hooks in the curing room, and lit a slow fire of oak chips and apple wood in a shallow iron pan on the flag floor, and she tended that fire from before light to after dark for 11 days, so that it never once burst into flame. She hung 6 hams on the beam that first curing, and when she took the first one down at the end of January and cut into the shoulder for Mrs. Peake to taste, Mrs. Peake stood in the boiling house doorway in her black wool, with her spectacles pushed up on her forehead, and chewed slowly, and swallowed, and said, "Well then, Lucy Walker," and went back up the beach walk with a wrapped half-flitch for the servants' hall. On the first Wednesday of February, Lucy took 2 hams by the carrier's cart to the market at Ashby, 7 miles by the turnpike road, and paid 2pence for a place at the end of the meat row and a butcher from the town of Melton, whose name was Mr. Ephraim Purley, aged 58, walked past 3 times before stopping, and cut a thin slice from the edge with his own knife, and gave her 17 shillings and sixpence for the pair without asking her name, and told her to bring 4 more the next market day. She brought 4 the next market day, and 6 the market day after, and by the end of March she had sold 22 hams, at prices between 8 and 11 shillings apiece, and had put back into the tin box, under the blue Lelia's flag, 3 of the 5 sovereigns she had drawn out, and had opened, at Mrs. Peake's direction, a small account at the Ashby Savings Bank in the name of Lucy Walker of Barley End. In April, Mr. Ridley came down the beach walk, with his leather book under his arm, having heard from the butcher Mr. Purley, through the steward of the neighboring estate, that a girl at Barley End was sending out hams of a quality he had not tasted since he was a boy. And he stood at the sty rail a long while, looking at the pigs, and then he asked Lucy where the animals had come from, and Lucy said, "From his grace, sir, out of this yard." And Mr. Ridley opened his leather book, and wrote a line, and closed it, and walked back up the beach walk without another word. He came again the following week, with an older man, in a bottle-green coat, a Mr. Gervase Onslow, aged 67, who had been steward at a manor called Ashbourne Hollow 40 years earlier, and Mr. Onslow leaned on the rail and looked at the pigs a long time, and said, "These are the old Ashbourne blacks, Ridley, that they turned out in the yard in 1836, when the family broke up. I would know the ears among 1,000. And Mr. Ridley wrote another line in his leather book, and thereafter men in coats came down the beach walk on most Tuesdays, and each one stood at the rail and looked, and each one, before he left, spoke to Lucy Walker by name. By the end of that summer, one of the men in coats was a Mr. Halbert Neve, aged 51, deputy to the county steward, who came down from the town of Loughborough with a written order for 4 whole hams to be sent by rail, in a crate lined with muslin, to a house in London whose name he did not give her. And Lucy cured them a full 15 weeks, and packed them herself in oat chaff, and sewed the muslin with linen thread by the light of the leaded window. And 3 weeks after that, a letter came for Mrs. Peake, and Mrs. Peake read it twice, at her writing desk in the housekeeper's room, and then walked down the beach walk in her black wool, without a shawl, though the wind was up, and stood in the boiling house doorway and said, "Lucy Walker, His Grace has had word that a ham of yours was set before the King at Windsor on the 14th, and the King asked whose it was, and His Grace has been asked to write and say." Lucy wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Yes, Mrs. Peake." Mrs. Peake looked at her a long moment and said, "Well then," and walked back up the beach walk, and Lucy sat down on the oak bench and did not cry, because Martha Bligh had taught her that a woman who cries at good news has not been given enough of it, and she took Martha Bligh's boning knife out of her apron pocket and laid it on the bench beside her, and she was quiet for a while. That November, on the morning of her 21st birthday, Lucy Walker stood in the curing room of the far yard at Barley End, with 14 hams hanging on Hannah Southey's black iron hooks, and a slow fire of oak and apple in the iron pan. And she lifted the blue Lyra's flag in the corner one more time, and she took the tin box out and set it on the bench in the boiling house, where the light from the leaded window fell on it, and she opened it and laid the things out. Hannah Southey's letter in its old creases, the silver thimble worn thin along one edge, the lock of pale brown hair tied with red thread, and the canvas purse, in which there were now, by her careful count, 119 sovereigns, saved from the sale of hams at a shilling, and a shilling at a time. She unwrapped Martha Bligh's boning knife from its oiled cloth, and laid it beside the thimble, and she thought of 2 women she had never seen together, one who had cured hams in that room from 1809 to 1840, and lost a daughter of 4, and one who had cured hams in a tarred smokehouse 6 miles west, and taught a granddaughter of 4 to read from a chapbook of hymns, and she thought that between them they had raised her, though one of them had been dead 30 years before she was born. She thought of the Duke in his green coat with mud on his boots, who had turned away before her answer, and of Mr. Ridley with his leather book, and of Mrs. Peake who had said, "Well then," and meant it, and of Whittle, who had held the lead mold, and of Tom Blay, who had run her notes, and of Mr. Purley, who had given her 17 and sixpence, without asking her name. She placed Martha Bligh's boning knife and Hannah Southey's silver thimble side by side on the folded letter, and closed the tin box, and set it back under the flag, and lowered the flag, and packed the joint with fresh lime. Lucy Walker was 19, and had nothing to her name, and no place in the county, and the Duke gave her 11 pigs he was ashamed of, because he wished them out of his sight, and she took them into the far yard of Barley End, with her grandmother's bone-handled boning knife in her apron pocket. They were the best 11 pigs she was ever given. If you have sat with this story to its end, we are grateful for your quiet company, and we would ask you, before you go, to leave a small mark that you were here, a like on the video, a word in the comments, telling us the county or country from which you are watching, and if you are not yet a subscriber, to subscribe, so that the next story we tell finds you waiting by the fire when it comes. We tell these stories slowly, and one at a time, of women in plain wool and cotton who were given the scraps of a world and made from them something the world eventually asked to be fed by, and each of them, before she was known by anyone, was known by one person who saw her clearly. Whether a grandmother in a tarred smokehouse, or a cook long dead under a blue Lisa's flag, and each of them carried into her hardest years a small object, a knife, a thimble, a chapbook, a letter, that reminded her she had once been loved without being weighed. So we would like to leave you with a question to sit with in your own quiet. Who was the person in your life who saw the value in you before anyone else did, when you were still the pig no one wanted in the yard? And what small object of theirs, a tool, a book, a ring, a letter, a photograph, a recipe written in a round, careful hand, do you keep now within reach of your own working days? And have you, lately, taken it out and laid it on the bench in the light of the window, and thanked them, aloud, in the room where you do your work? Tell us if you would, in a line below. We will read every one, and until the next story, may your own far yard, wherever it lies and whatever it holds, be a place of your own choosing.